almost too complex of a study, but he's done a fantastic job. And you'll see all the variables that he assessed. And I know when he was developing the study, he was researching and presenting to us, the committee, and coming to us almost, I think, like weekly with something new he wanted to add to it. So it's definitely very, he did a fantastic job, put a lot of work, a lot of time in data collection, and of course in writing it up. And I think going into next year and the year after, at least in the next, couple academic years, he's going to have a lot of scholarship he's going to have produced from this as far as presentations and a publication, at least. So, but as I'll let Christian kind of get you a little short, maybe background of, kind of what it was like to develop the project, and then you go ahead and present your study.
All right, yeah. Hey guys, my name's Christian. So this is my thesis. So I did a thesis on the comparison of muscle activity, barbell velocity, and ground reaction force during variations of the bench press. So a lot of questions I get asked through the people who participated and people I just talk about this project with is why. So my background, I come from a powerlifting background. So if y'all don't know, powerlifting involves the squat, bench, and deadlift specifically, just those three. Those are compound free weight barbell movements. And those have been researched thoroughly, very, very thoroughly. And so with that background, I always wanted to do something within the squat, bench, or deadlift. And so just reading those articles that related to anything powerlifting, I kept coming across all these articles that specifically related to the bench press and looking for further research within XYZ. Up here, this one on the left, it says determining changes in muscle activity and performance following different training protocols, establishing the changes in EMG activity and kinematic variables in numerous repetitions of the bench press while developing strength endurance. Future research should examine the effect of leg drive utilizing a higher or lower percentage of participants when at max. And then more studies are needed to analyze the influence of hip flexor muscle activation on lumbar spine stress in the bench press exercise. So there's a need for, or questions being produced through this topic. So that's why I chose the bench press and its exercises. So now the primary muscle movers for the bench press. So we got the pecs, or the pectoralis major specifically, the triceps brachii, specifically the long head, and then the anterior delt. So the pecs, you got the pec major, pec minor. We're only going to be focusing on the major. For the triceps, you got the medial head, long head, lateral head. We're going to focus on the long head. And then for the anterior delt, you have the anterior, medial, posterior. For this, we're going to do anterior delt. So now during the bench press, you can see which muscles are highlighted throughout the different phases of the bench press movement. So when we're at the top phase, when we're at the bottom phase, you can see how the pecs, anterior delts, and triceps are fully activated down at the bottom. And then at the top, as it goes through, the triceps are the ones fully activated at the top. So when we get into the muscle activation, I'll talk specifically more about that, but just to give you all a general idea of what muscles are activated where throughout the different phases of the bench press, this is what that's for. So now the setup. So this is just going to be a rough explanation of the bench press in general, not any variation, just bench press. Okay, so the setup. So when you lay in a supine position with your eyes directly under the bar, if you were to go too far past the bar, whether your bar is lined up directly under your chin or chest, you're going to have a good possibility of banging the J hooks, or something's going to throw you off. If you're too far away from the bar, where it's up here, it's going to have a hard time unracking and being in a stable, comfortable position to be able to perform the movement. You have to maintain 5 points of contact throughout the whole time. So we're going to have our left foot, right foot, butt, upper back, and head. And so those should not leave the ground or points of contact at any time throughout the movement. So then we're going to use a closed pronated shoulder width grip. So now that grip can vary from person to person, but generally slightly wider than shoulder width. So now this picture in the back, that is the background, depicts what retract the scapula mean. So this guy on the left, he is not retracting the scapula, and then the guy on the right is retracting the scapula. Can you see how that kind of changes the bench press? You have a stable, strong upper back. You don't have loose shoulders when benching. It's just just a normal bench, versus the unretracted scapula where it's out and you have loose shoulders. They just move with. So then lastly, got to stack the wrist. So stack the wrist is just a term that we use. So that just means in line with the forearms. You don't want the bar to roll your wrist or have loose wrists, either way, specifically not that way. But if you go this way, you want that force being applied directly into the barbell. So that's what that is. So then we start the actual bench press. So the downward movement phase. So after you got set up, then we're gonna start unracking the bar and bring the bar over the upper chest level. So somewhere within here, up and over. So then we're gonna do something called the Valsalva maneuver, which is an inhale and brace of air. So you're gonna inhale almost into your stomach and expand it like a balloon. So the Valsalva maneuver actually maximizes intra-abdominal pressure while increasing the rigidity of the torso. There's a whole lot of different variables that can go into it, whether you blow out through your mouth, keep your mouth closed while blowing out, almost like a puffer fish, or just keep it all within your stomach. That just kind of depends on the individual. But then, after you brace with that air, you're gonna slowly start lowering the bar to your chest. Now the elbows are gonna maintain a 45-degree angle from the shoulder joint. So that just means that as this bar is coming down, this elbow angle needs to stay in that 45-degree, not too close, not too far out. If those were to be too far out, the bar is gonna come up towards here and not touch between the nipple and xiphoid process, which is where there's usually the highest point on the chest that the bar does need to come down and touch. Now if it were too far, the elbows were too far in, just mechanically you're gonna come down a little too far lower than what you normally would for the bench press. So then after the touch at the chest, the upward movement phase begins when the bar is initially pushed off the chest. Then it is followed by a slight delay of an exhale breath of air. So come down, touch the chest, and then once it gets about 2-3 inches off the chest while the bar is still moving, that's when you want to breathe out from that Valsalva and brace. And then the upward movement ends when the elbows are fully extended and the bar is back above the upper chest level. So something that is common in pretty much anybody who benches is called the sticking point. So this sticking point occurs right after the transition from the eccentric phase to the concentric phase, typically about 4 inches above the chest. So once you come down about 4 inches, once the pecs, or this is caused by the pecs being the primary muscle mover to becoming the secondary muscle mover when it gets taken over by the triceps. So once it comes down, touch chest still the main muscle mover, coming up about 4 inches. And then it switches to the triceps, and then the triceps take over for the rest of the lift. So now something, bar path. This bar path tracks a curved linear line. So over here on this far side, this is what the novice lifter bar path usually looks like. So you got the descent that just comes down, and the ascent that pushes straight up and then back towards the eyes. That is actually not the way to bench. The correct way that Mike Bridges and Bill Kazmaier bench, who are pro benchers, bench like this green arrow line, where the bar comes down to the chest and then pushes directly back to the eyes and then back up. That's where you get that drive from those triceps back towards the face. And so that's where you can see from a novice to professionals, and also what's supposed to happen versus what's not supposed to happen. Okay, so we got bar path, now we have range of motion. The range of motion is typical flat bench is going to be full range of motion. So that means all the way up, all the way down. So now with the Valsalva maneuver and with the technique of leg drive, you can actually slightly change that range of motion to have a less range of motion. So those two pictures on the side depict each of those. But as you can see from the top guy, that is with a flat back. Then when he fully expands his rib cage, you can see how it's slightly more elevated. Now take that slightly more elevation and then also apply it to the leg drive technique, and you can see how much higher that top of the chest is from the flat bench. And so that's just a little bit decrease in range of motion. Okay, so now we got the flat bench. So this was me, and this is our setup in the lab. And so all of that described the flat bench, so I don't gotta talk about this anymore. But I do want to show y'all the difference between the flat bench and the leg drive. So the leg drive has the feet placed directly under or behind the level of the knees. Then also want to create an arch in the back. People can create that arch simply by lying down and creating an arch, a natural arch, whatever happens, or by pushing against the bar to push your upper body towards your butt, creating more of an arch. So I'm gonna go back and forth just so you can see the difference. So first, look at the legs. See how they're slightly different. And then also, if you can look at my ribs and arch in the back, see how it's flat versus slightly elevated and raised. So now with the leg drive, throughout the entire time, the quads are going to be or create tension and just stay tense to force that lower body almost into a spring-like action to create that energy going through and then all the way up into your chest. The leg drive comes from driving the legs into the ground. Crazy, right? But that's what that leg drive is for, driving the heels into the ground to drive the bar off the chest. And the many lifters have indicated that performing the leg drive actually gives them a sense of improved performance, and we'll get into that further. So lastly, the third variation that we're going to examine is the Larson press. So this has active hip and knee flexion at 90 degrees, holding their knees directly above the pelvis. So this supports the spinal column simply by the bench. Normally, in the leg drive and flat techniques, we would have our legs be our supporters, but since our legs are being removed from this, that's where the low back comes in as the stabilizer, or the low back and the upper body comes in as the stabilizer. So now, surface electromyography. When I first wanted to do this study, I wanted to test the difference between the pec major and pec minor between the different variations. Well, the only way to get to the pec minor is to put a needle through the pec major into the pec minor. And I don't know about y'all, but I don't want to bench with a needle in my chest. And so we went with SEMG. And so the pectoralis major at the top picture was placed just superior to the axillary fold. So we got our armpit fold, it's just superior to that. Drew a vertical line and then placed 2 electrode pads on each side. These electrode pads are 10 millimeters long, and it was actually found that the 10 to 20 millimeters was the best for picking up those muscle activation. So when you put 10 and 10 together, that's 20, and so put them right next to each other. You got a positive and negative source. That's how we were able to pick it up. So now for the anterior delt, you got 3 finger breadths below the anterior margin of the acromion. So you find the anterior margin of the acromion right here, 3 finger breadths below, and that's where the muscle belly, or for the electrodes, are going to be placed there. And then for the triceps brachii, it was placed 4 finger breadths distal to the posterior axillary fold. So we'd have the participant stand with their arms straight out to the side, find where the armpit crease is again, 4 finger breadths, vertical line right there. And then we had a ground electrode placed on the C7. So barbell velocity. So this is the amount of force that a muscle can produce, and it has a negative linear relationship to the amount of load. And then tendo units and linear position transduction devices is the official name for tendo units, but we actually use that to pick up these. So they have average power, partial average power, peak velocity, partial average velocity, and then peak force. So we're actually, even though it gives us 6 variables, we only needed 3 of those variables. And so we're going to be looking at the peak velocity, average velocity, and peak force. But this, when set up, the string is placed directly below the barbell, and it is measured through, or it's put on the edge of the barbell, and as the barbell is going down, on the way up, the string is extended and can measure those. So now, ground reaction force is also a different thing that we can use. And to find that, we actually use force plates. So force plates are used to measure velocity, power, balance, gait, assessing left and right asymmetry. Then for a subjective scale, we used this RPE scale. So we used this one specifically because it had the 0.5 measurements. Normally, when you just get done lifting, that's when we would ask someone, hey, what was your RPE throughout that lift? And they're not able to give an exact one, but they are able to look at this chart and see, oh, I had 1 rep left, that means it was an RPE 9. Oh, I don't know if I had 2, maybe I had 1 to 2, 1.5, oh, that's an RPE 8.5. And so that's why we use this chart. So now this study design was a randomized counterbalance crossover design that allowed for the effects of the bench press variation to be determined within the same participant. So we didn't want to have someone do a leg drive, someone else do a flat, someone else do the Larson. We wanted each individual person to do all 3, and we had to do it randomized, and I'll explain that in a minute when we get to the weekly protocol. So this involved 9 total visits, 3 familiarization, 3 experimental. And it was separated by 48 to 72 hours because of muscle soreness, and we are pushing them pretty hard with the 1 rep max. So there was 26 total participants, 15 male and 11 female, all ages 19 to 25, and they all had above average muscular fitness. So here's the weekly protocol. So week 1, the very top line going all the way across, this is just that experimental visit. So you got 3, they came in 3 times a week, and they just did a 3x3 at an ACV, which is average concentric velocity, which was measured through that Tendo unit, at a ACV of 0.62. So 0.62 roughly translates to 65% of their 1 rep max. So we didn't have them find their max at all until the week 2. So we just used whatever weight they had that was on the bar that was an ACV of 0.62, and we used that as a 3x3 to familiarize them to whatever form they were doing for that day, along with the training protocol, because they'll be doing a 3x3 later on. So the first visit was the flat bench, the second visit was the leg drive, the third visit was the Larson. It kind of went in difficulty order, so everybody that did participate already knew the bench, or the traditional flat bench. Some needed a little bit more experience with the leg drive than others, but majority people got that. Virtually nobody had done the Larson press before. So that's why that one was saved at the end, to get them comfortable within the rack, within all the testing parameters, comfortable within the room, whatever was going on. We also allowed them to listen to their own music, whatever they wanted, however loud they wanted, relatively. It was a good time. So then week 2 happened, and that's the start of the first experimental visits. So visit 4, it's variation 1. So it is a randomized variation, whether that is flat, leg drop, or Larson, randomized. Week 3, if they did flat, on week 2, they would do Larson or leg drop week 3, and then whichever one following week 4. But for the first experimental visit, we would warm them up all the way to a 1 rep max. We didn't know the 1 rep max at the time, so we followed the testing protocol for a 1 rep max, increase as needed. Found their 1 rep max, immediately gave them a 10-minute rest. After they had that 10-minute rest, we had them do 70% of that 1 rep max for as many reps as possible. So then the second experimental visit came around later in that week, where they replicated that same 1 rep max and then rested 10 minutes again, and then did 3 reps at 75%, 3 reps at 80%, and 3 reps at 85%, each with 3-minute rest in between those. And then that followed for the remaining of the study. So now, maxing 6 times in 3 weeks is very hard, and there have been several studies put out that show that just by doing a 1 rep max is going to increase your 1 rep max. Not only that, but because it's randomized, if we did it in order, flat, leg drive, Larson, they're going to be stronger by the end in Larson and not give us a totally accurate representation of the Larson 1 rep max. So that's why it had to be random. So for the stats that we actually ran, so we ran separate repeated measures of ANOVAs on the 1 rep max, 70%, and velocity measurements for the 1 rep max, dependent samples t-test for peak ground reaction force, separate 3x4 within factorial ANOVAs with repeaters and measures for peak and average velocity electrical activity of the prime movers, another 3x4 within factorial ANOVA for percent of 1 rep max on velocity measures, and then a 3x3 factorial ANOVA for the effects of variation and percent of 1 rep max and on RPE. So the stats between 1 rep max and 70%. This was shocking because all research up until this point has showed that there was no difference between leg drive and flat. Nothing's been shown on the Larson yet, but this is pretty significant, stating that there is a difference between all 3 variations, specifically the leg drive. We'll get into that later. Now 70% for rep max, there is no difference between how many reps they can get within variation. So now for the muscle activation. This is where that 3x3 repeated measure ANOVA I was talking about, 1, 2, 3. So these top 2 are going to be within subjects. This last one's going to be between subject. So on the right side, or on the left side of all these upcoming slides, it's going to be peak, or everything data related to peak. On the left side, or right side, everything's going to be related to average. So we had all of these numbers from all these data points, and we wanted to see when we got those numbers down into one number, there are 2 ways that we could do that, whether by taking the average of the 3x3s or just the one maximal number of that 3x3. So we decided to do both just to see what would happen. So we didn't find anything on the peaks for the pec major, but we did find something within the percent of the 1 rep max on the average electrical activity of the pec major. And that's from that 70% being lower than all the rest. Then we move on to the anterior delts, and there is the same trend following within that percent of 1 rep max and the average side, but nothing on the peak side. Of the triceps, we found a significance in both the peak and average for the percent of 1 rep max, meaning that each percent is different from each other. So this kind of plays into the Henneman size principle. So as more load is being applied, more muscles or more neurons are being sent to recruit more muscles to produce more of a force. And it starts with these smaller muscles and increases to the larger muscles as the load gets heavier. Typically those smaller muscles are the type 1, those bigger muscles that recruit later on are the type 2, those big strong muscles. Go back real quick. Something between all 3 of these, it's already been shown through previous studies that there is no interaction between any of these variations in muscle activity. So that's what we were expecting. But given that the trend on the triceps specifically, it's almost significant, but not quite there. Nothing like the delts and pecs. So now the peak velocity measurements. So velocity is displacement divided by time. So again, remember this goes into that 3x4 repeated measures ANOVA, with the bottom one being the between them, and the top 3 being within. So we found significance in the 1 rep max variation and percent of 1 rep max, but nothing within or between each other, the one that we were trying to look for. They're individually significant, but not significant related to each other. So that same trend follows for average velocity, for the peak and average as well. And then peak force, again, following that same trend. For the ground reaction force, there was a significance. I mean, of course, we have leg drive versus non-leg drive. Something to show, or that was a nuance, was the 70% flat. If y'all can see it on the top one. The 70% flat is higher than the 85% flat. Something that we could use to explain that, or that may have happened, was that when people were within the protocol, they went from a 1 rep max directly to a 70% rep max. So they were applying that same 1 rep max force, 1 rep max pressure, whether that's the speed of the lift or the pressure into the ground, the same as they were applying it into the 100, the same as the 70. And then versus having a 3x3, which is just 3 reps, not a rep max, going as many as you can. So 1, 2, 3, done, versus 15, absolutely grinding it out. So then here at the bottom shows another relationship between the average and the peak. We just wanted to see both of those, no significance between that, other than the leg drive does produce more force than the flat bench. So now we have RPE. There was no significance. There was no significance within or between each other. So 75, 80, and 85. Each of them are different. The 75 is different than the 80, 80 is different than the 85, but within all of them are the same difficulty. So that could be related to taking each individual variation as their own and lifting or finding their 1 rep max and then taking specifically 75, 80, or 85% of that. If we use the flat bench as a control and used the leg drive and Larson technique, there may have been a different outcome, but when treating them as individually, there is no difference in difficulty. So the conclusion, so no significant difference between the prime muscle movers in the bench press variation. That same trend was found when evaluating barbell velocity, but there was a significant difference for 1 rep max and the ground reaction force. So the variation implications. So the flat is a good base for bench press. If you're just learning bench press, go with the flat. So that's going to help you develop muscle coordination, movement coordination, muscle synchronization. And then with the leg drive seems to be a skill-based movement that is only viable for higher loads. You're able to lift more, and it does perceive easier, but once again, that could be related to using like your flat bench 1 rep max, and then using that as for the leg drive, it's going to move easier. But when you use individual, it's going to be hard. And then for the Larson press is great for people who need to work out or still lift through a lower back injury. While there is no difference in muscle activation, you can still get the same stimulus that you need to work out. So then here are my references. Any questions?
Yeah, let's open up for questions and then, go ahead, Dr. Mauser.
Could you please go back to the slide immediately before the results of peak velocity? Yeah, that one right there. So you use the word trend a lot.
Yes.
Be careful when you use the word trend in stats.
Okay.
So when we see things change, you didn't do a longitudinal study. So saying trend really implies over time. Like in this stuff. The
Yeah, thank you.
Put in a lot of work on it. I'm really happy with the results. They are interesting. They are, I think, valued and needed, you know, given the follow-up to Fa's work with velocity, and then looking at the different bench press variations. I think this was well done.
Yeah, thank
Nice
you.
work.
Wow, thank you.
I have one.
Yeah.
Could you? I know you said some variation applications. Could you give me some like more practical applications of when would I choose a leg drive? Maybe if I'm being sport specific, or what type of, I guess, stimulus am I looking for if I'm choosing each variation? What would be the
So-
benefits of?
There is no difference in muscle activation. So when talking about whether to use one or the other, that's going to come down to whatever you're dealing with at the time, and then also training goals. So if you're training for baseball, for example, they use the athletic position quite a lot. Something that could be used to reinforce that athletic position would
Between each. Very first one, yeah. So, could you just clarify maybe on the left side, are they all different than each other?
Yes, they're all different from each other. You got the weight in kilograms. So the leg drive roughly touching 92, flat roughly touching 89, and then Larson 86. They're all 3-ish kilograms away from each other. Or I'm sorry, the leg drive's 3-ish kilograms away from the flat, and then the Larson is 3 away from the flat. So all statistically significant from each other. Which that is a huge finding. That is a huge finding.
I suppose to go back to what Herman said, like if you wanted to get the most weight, do the leg
Yeah,
drive.
leg drive items right there. Yeah.
But just for training, you kind of said doesn't really matter.
I would say. Sorry.
I'm gonna ask, I was thinking that same thing too, because, the leg drive, you're not sure, because you didn't do anything as far as force with legs, right? Like you weren't able to, like their pressure, you don't know how much force was going, but they were extending through their legs, right?
So that's what the ground reaction force did.
Okay, and that is
yes.
okay, that's what I wanted to see.
Yep. And so the red being leg drive, flat being the blue. There was no need for Larson because legs are in the air, but we were able to measure the force through the legs into the ground using the force plate.
Okay. Yep, that's what I wanted to see. So it does make a huge difference.
Oh yeah. So I mean, even when you're just doing a flat bench, obviously their feet were still you're on the ground, you're pushing a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit the whole
Yeah.
time. Yeah, sometimes there were a few odd ones, I guess, who had more of a leg drive when performing the flat than they did the actual leg drive, which was crazy. I wasn't expecting that at all, but they just did.
Would that be maybe experience level?
I think that may be. That happened twice, or in 2 guys and in 1 girl. And those were the ones that really needed practice with the leg drive. They had performed it before, and then by the time they got up to the experimental visits, they were very proficient in the leg drive. But I guess I don't know what happened. I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask too. You group them all together? You didn't like just look at females versus males, or
Yeah, nope.
you just group them
Yeah, all together.
So do you think you would find anything different,
I don't know.
or did they just overall have the same?
I think. Are you asking?
I mean,
between,
I know the guys are naturally
Yeah, I was about to say, I
stronger.
think
I know
guys-
they're naturally stronger, but do you think that hurt your stats with having because they all increased that much?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
I have one more, and maybe this is just me getting ahead of myself because I'm excited to see this. But did any of the people, did you see any like muscular change whenever they did leg drive? Maybe like the anterior delts were being used less with the leg drive choice than you would here?
Let me use. Are you asking specifically for the anterior delts?
Sure.
Okay.
Just to make a comparison.
Okay, so again, this is the peak and the average.
Right.
So then let's use leg drive, for example. That's a really good one to use leg drive on.
Mm-hmm.
So you got 70% and 80%. You see how those are less activity than the other muscles within
Right.
that group, or the other variations within that group. But those, while it is less, it's not statistically different.
Gotcha.
So it is slightly less,
Okay.
just no
Right.
significance.
Okay. Cool.
And then same thing, I'll go through all that for you, just so you can see that a little bit longer. Here, the 85% is interesting
Mm-hmm.
of the flat. Yeah.
That just an anomaly.
Mm-hmm. Pretty much
Meaning-
could be with pretty could be.
Cool.
And then the triceps. Which triceps at 70%, that was shocking to see. But then once we get into the higher rep ranges. So something that I did notice when evaluating these stats, sorry for using trend earlier, but I kind of noticed a trend. I don't know what other words, yes, I'm going to use trend loosely. But
And if you see a pattern emerging,
Pattern, that's a good word.
pattern, that's it, yeah.
Pattern
and if you see a
or
pattern, it's what they
change.
call a pattern. But yeah.
So I did a pattern. There we go. So I did notice a pattern between all of the muscle activation stats, where yes, it gets less, or you use less muscle activity as the percents drop, but at the same time, at these 75 and 70 percentages, they are getting very much different than the higher percentages. So that meaning that if another study was done at even lower percentages, there may be a chance to see those patterns progress. Yeah.
And you can always say positive change.
Mhm,
I
there you
use
go.
that a lot, a
Okay.
positive change, especially when I don't find something significantly different. I just will say positive change. I can't account for it.
Yep.
But you can always say
So that's I would like to see that, but we'll see. We'll see.
So all of none of your students or participants were college athletes?
I had 2 that were, and those were soccer players, 2 girl soccer players. All the rest were recreationally active. I did it on my own. Yep, good.
So this is good. Your stats are good.
So what's your take-home message? What's your
Take home
What's
message,
your summary
if
of
you
the
want to
whole
be
study?
strong and move the most amount of weight, leg drive.
Yep.
If you're still hurting, or if you have a low back injury and you still want to bench, do Larson. They all have the same muscle activation and roughly the same barbell velocity speed. So it really comes to training implications and training goals, which I would have
And if
liked.
you're doing
Where'd the Lar-
powerlifting, you definitely
where'd the
wanna do
Larson
it.
come from? Why did it come about?
So there's actually
Someone
3.
just
Yes,
put
there's a
the gym one
guy.
day and just put their feet in the air or
Some
something?
guy wanted to actually. There's 3 different variations of the Larson press.
Oh, there's variations
Yeah,
of
there's different
variations.
variations
Okay.
of the variation. Yeah.
That's your next study.
So within right there. But so there's this one where you're. There's this one. The next one is where your feet are on the edge of the bench, not on the ground, but on the edge of the bench. And then another one where your feet are straight out. Those kind of work as counterbalances, and you're actually using the bench as a balance when using those, but we're trying to isolate the upper body musculature as much as possible. So that's why we chose this one. Just to see if there was any variation between any difference between variation in the muscle activation. But yeah, we picked this one. And then what, you asked something about Larson, was that it?
I guess this is where it came from.
Yeah, some guy wanted to change up normal bench, make it harder. And I don't know if you've ever performed Larson with legs straight out or like this, but you're engaging your entire core that entire time just for stability. And so it adds a little bit extra fun and just different than normal bench press.
So I know sometimes when we do in class here, we'll do like bench press with people who've never really done bench press. That's one of the first things we'll do is they lift the feet
With
up.
their legs.
Yep.
Like they're struggling and their feet come up.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know why they do that, but they do.
Yeah, just training and experience. Snoozing? So it is worse. Yeah, no good.
Or we might lose him.
Uh-oh. You didn't have the power?
I think it's okay.
We'll have to call him back in a minute or so. We'll see. You got a minute, 39 seconds until you're disconnected, and I can't.
Oh.
I can't fix that.
It may just be the 30-minute timer. I don't think they'll shut him off. Maybe if it's Zoom or Teams.
I think it's Teams.
Teams.
They just have a little meeting.
Yeah. Well, this computer hasn't been on the network in 2 weeks. So it wants to restart you, Grant.
Wants to restart. It's good old
Back to
free
Troy
updates.
IT.
I
Yeah.
can't stop it.
I got one more question for you.
Yeah.
With, I guess if Dr. Mauser has a question, ask quickly.
Yeah, we'll,
Yeah.
in case we do.
You're good? He's good.
We'll get you back on there in a few.
Yeah, we'll get you back on if we can.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Which one was harder to teach? The Larson or the leg drive?
Leg drive.
Leg drive.
As technical as it was, the leg drive, because of its specific techniques. The Larson, it had the lightest 1 rep max, and so while they weren't dealing with heavier loads, they're still dealing with a 1 rep max within the one variation. So it was as much as they could push for their one variation. But the mental aspect of, oh, this is lighter than my actual 1 rep max, I can handle that easy, whatever. But no, the leg drop was the hardest just because some people would push more with flat into the ground than they would leg drive. And then also teaching, or more like synchronizing, when they would be driving into the ground and driving the bar up. That was kind of hard. He's gone. That was that was hard to teach, but eventually everybody got there. And it was kind of me like drop through the leg every rep. Like I'd be standing over through the leg.
Now and what was the tempo for for all the participants? Explain to them the tempo.
So we didn't have a set tempo, like 1 or 2 seconds down, pause, 1 second up. We just had a normal movement tempo, 1 second down, touch the chest, 1 second back up. There was no bouncing involved. It was a touch and go, not a bounce and go. And also we didn't do a pause just because that pause would have taken away from maybe some of the muscle activation, even probably definitely from the barbell velocity. It would have slowed down. So another training study just like this could be done with paused, maybe. All the 1 rep maxes are going to go down, but something else could change. We'll see.
It's kind of neat. You address the technique, and that's you went into this study already very familiar with technique, Herman as well from your background, and being able to control all those items as far as tempo, technique, repeating, learning the different techniques. It makes us feel confident, that the data that you're looking at is a legitimate comparison of, the different variations and the percentages of those variations.
I'm actually, Herman is actually one of my teachers who kind of got me into powerlifting and learned. So it was nice and fun to be able, and I'll support that by saying, knowing the background of the different variations, knowing the bench press inside and out, knowing leg drop inside and out was probably benefited most of the participants just because I was able to teach. Like I knew it like the back of my hand, and was able to teach them. Now they know it just as much as I do in the few amount of weeks that we had together.
Right.
So yeah, it was good that way.
Yeah, I started kind of introducing Christian. I went through a great study. He did an awesome job. And what I meant by complexity is the number of I'm referring to the number of variables that he had. And, from a thesis standpoint, I think just a comparison of 1 rep max, repetition max itself, or just a couple of the velocity measurements, let alone 6, or maybe a couple of the power measurements, which we didn't even include in here, the power data, or the ground reaction forces, peak and average, RPEs, cross percentages, and then the tricep brachii, anterior delts, and pec major across all percentages, including the maxes between the 3 variations. I mean, there's, it's a storm of data. So like you did a tremendous job, and it's almost like you could say there's 3 or 4 thesis projects within it in a way, but it wasn't. You had a project, and then you're saying, hey, I can do this data. I got the tendo, or I got this. We got the force plate. And it didn't disrupt anything, and so now, what do we leave out of thesis? And we ended up really just leaving the power data out, but you didn't really need the power data to support what you're looking at. So when I'm referring to the scholarship, I know Herman's going through this now. You're going to present your study at the NSCA next week.
Tomorrow.
Yeah, that's right.
Tomorrow, just tomorrow.
Yeah.
I actually thought it was, I thought you'd be there.
So
right?
Christian will be doing the same thing,
Yeah, it's got a lot.
NSCA and Journal of Transition Research, and and of course there's
You're
studies.
just gonna have to remember
Yeah.
you're gonna have to separate some of this out and pretend you didn't collect it. It's sort
You
of-
might have to visit laboratories to build the force plate into their bench press form.
Ooh, hey, I
Yeah.
mean, did it here once, I can try to do it again.
Yeah, you could. That'll be some tutorial at a conference.
Yeah.
Because that was a major undertaking in itself. When Christian said he basically insisted on doing that, and we're like, oh gosh, well we don't even have a bench. It's
It'll work.
$2,500 bench, and within 30 minutes, Dr. Schluter found out and said, let's get it. So it's like, okay, well that was quick, and then before you know it, they're running up to Lowe's buying which I thought was going to be a 6-month process. It turned out to be like
3 days.
yeah, and then we were just waiting on the truck to deliver the machine or the bench. So, but you insisted. I'm glad you stayed committed to it, because it turned out to be. We were just worried. Man, it's going to delay you too much and that kind of stuff. And it turned out, all the.
So the original plan was to defend and do everything, pretty much graduate at the end of last semester, but that didn't happen because the bench that we used didn't get here until 2, 3, 4 weeks later than intended, so that pushed the start of the study back even more, and I was able to cram everybody in before the end of the semester. So people who went on summer break, I was able to get them in. Pretty much we did have everybody done before the end of last semester. Now we were just running the stats, getting the last bit of stuff ready for the paper, and then now we're presenting. So all this was supposed to happen a few months ago, now it's happening now. So everything's good now. Caught back up, or feeling caught up, I guess.
I think what's good when you do a lot of data like this is that the stuff that you weren't testing, that some of your results, they just make sense, and that's important. If even just your 1 rep max stuff that it's on the screen, but like makes sense that the leg drive should be higher, and you showed that just justifies that the rest of your data is probably going to be good too.
Well,
when you find weird things in your basic stuff, it can be like, oh, what's gone wrong? What did you do wrong?
Several studies have shown that there is no difference between leg drive and flat, and so I was reading those, and I was wondering, yes, there is. And so I'm glad I did this study. So now, we have the proof that there is a difference. And then same thing.
Have you gone in and tried to figure out why? Like, was there some nuances as to why they didn't find a difference?
No, I have not. I don't know. Everything it makes sense except the part where there is no difference between 1 rep max. And that's. I'll have to look further into that. But this, in its entirety, makes sense.
I've most compared flat to leg drive and not velocity.
Yeah. Yep.
All right, well, good job, Chris. Any other questions? I'm gonna pop, you get, yeah, I'm gonna pop, Dr. Mauser, we'll have a little, we have some discussion as far as, the